Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the book of Micah in our continuing survey of the Old Testament. Micah 1:1, the word of the Lord which came to Micah of Moresheth in the days of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, which he saw concerning Samaria and Jerusalem. Notice he's going to be prophesying about both the northern and the southern kingdom. Place where he is, notice we've got a timeline. I've got some prophets on the left. You can see Jonah, Amos, Hosea, and Isaiah. And then notice in the blue you have the dynasty, the fourth dynasty of the northern kingdom of Israel. And when that ends, you've got quite a lot of unrest. See all those kings, Menahem and Pekahiah and Pekah and Hushai. And then the northern kingdom comes to an end. And meanwhile, the southern kingdom, they're having some troubled times too, but you have continuity from Amaziah all the way down to Hezekiah. And Micah is a contemporary specifically of Isaiah. In fact, there's a section where I'm not sure if Isaiah is quoting from Micah or Micah is quoting from Isaiah, or they're both quoting from the same source. But there's a small section where it's going to be word for word the same, and that doesn't happen by chance. So here's our outline of Micah. Chapters, it's three sections. Chapters 1 through 2 is our first oracle. And it's going to start off talking about judgment, and specifically judgment against idolatry, that is, the worship of pagan gods, and sometimes using idols to try to worship God. Both are wrong. But there's a promise of eventual regathering. And then the second oracle, chapters 3 through 5, are going to be, again, notice judgment and then promise. So this is judgment against the rulers, and then promise of future glory. And the third oracle, chapter 6 and 7, again, it's going to be judgment and promise. It will be judgment against disloyalty, and that will actually be set up in sort of a covenantal lawsuit because, we use that term loving kindness. I actually like the translation of that term chesed. I like the term loyalty. And so this is a judgment against that disloyal. They've been disloyal, but there's going to be a promise of future restoration. Chapter 1, verse 6, for I will make Samaria, that's the northern kingdom, and that's specifically the capital of the northern kingdom. I will make Samaria a heap of ruins in the open country, planting places for a vineyard. I will pour her stones down into the valley and will lay bare her foundations. You can go to Jerusalem today, and Jerusalem yes, it was destroyed a few times, but it's been rebuilt. Notice verse 7, all of her idols will be smashed. This is Samaria. All of her idols will be smashed. All of her earrings will be burned with fire. All of her images I will make desolate, for she collected them from a harlot's earnings, and to the earnings of a harlot they will return. Go to Samaria today, and the site of the city is still ruins. It was destroyed, and yes, it did go through something of a rebuilding, but it's ruins today. Now, we get to verse 10, and there's a line here that starts off, tell it not in Gath, weep not at all. And at that point, you're supposed to say, wait a minute, I remember this song. I remember it from 2 Samuel chapter 1. This was part of the song of lament that David wrote at the death of Saul. And so notice here I've got a few verses from that. Beginning verse 19, your beauty, O Israel, is slain on your high places. How the mighty have fallen. That's the refrain in David's song, speaking of how Saul had fallen. And here's that line, verse 20, tell it not in Gath. Now you notice it doesn't continue that. Just the one line, tell it not in Gath, is enough for you to have, just like if I say, oh, say, can you see? Excuse my bad singing, but that's enough for you to get the Star Spangled Banner. And the same thing here. This is enough for you to pick up on that song, tell it not in Gath, we proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult. That's enough for you to pick it up and to recognize it. Now what we have then, tell it not in Gath, weep not at all, at Beth Le'aphra, roll yourself in the dust. And Beth is the word for house. Beth Le'aphra is house of dust. In the house of dust, roll yourself in dust. And that begins a whole series of word plays. Now, we're not going to go through all of those in the Hebrew. What I'm going to do is give you my own very, very loose translation. What I've done here, I've substituted the places in Israel because that's what he does. He has a whole series of place names in Israel with plays on words. And I've replaced it for cities and areas in South Florida, where I live. So if you're from South Florida, you'll get this. If you're not, my apologies. You can skip over it. It won't make much sense. But let me read it to you. Dade is browbeaten by Broward County, but the wise avoid Miami's vices. Boca Raton has closed its mouth, you have to speak Spanish to get that, toward those that travel on I-95 South. With the coming of day in Del Rey, the sun will set in Sunrise. As the gate is locked in Margate, the lights are out in Lighthouse Point, and the deer have fled the field of Deerfield Beach. Hollywood would be holy if Davy were not so lazy. Pompano is full of pomp as Wilton minds its manners. Now, no offense, I'm just playing with the words. I'm not passing judgment on all those places. I happen to live in one of those cities. But this is what Micah does, except with place names that his readers knew. We get to chapter 4 and verse 1, and it will come about in the last days that the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and peoples will stream to it. Now, I don't think this means that there's going to be a mountain that literally gets up higher than all the other mountains. I don't think we're supposed to read it literally. But this does remind us that there is a mountain theme running through a number of books of the Old Testament. This mountain theme starts off maybe even earlier, but we see it the most plainly in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 1, where Moses comes to the mountain of God. There it was Mount Sinai, and there God gives the law. We have the Song of Moses that reflects this in Exodus chapter 15, verse 17, where Moses sings, "You will bring them and plant them in the mountain of your inheritance, the place, O Lord, which you have made for your dwelling, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established." Is that Mount Sinai, or is that some other mountain to which they will eventually come? You see. And then we have the mountain of God and the covering cherub that we saw in Ezekiel chapter 28, verses 14 and 16, looking back to Eden, actually. Now, chapter 4, verse 2, then, notice, "Come and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord and to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us about his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For from Zion," you begin to see where the mountain of the Lord is in Micah's day. "For from Zion will go forth the law, even the word of the Lord from Jerusalem." The mountain of God in Micah's day is now seen in Jerusalem. Verse 3, "And he," that is God, "he will judge between many peoples and render decisions for mighty distant nations. Then they will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they train for war." Notice they take their swords and they make them implements of peace. Remember how earlier we saw the opposite in a previous prophet. We saw the prophet calling them to take their farm implements and hammer them into swords. Now it's going back, a promise of eventual peace. Each one of them will sit under his vine and under his fig tree, with no one to make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. And this is a throwback to the days of Solomon, where in 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 25, we read that Judah and Israel lived, and this is in the days of Solomon, they lived in safety, every man under his vine and his fig tree, even from Dan to Beersheba. Remember, Dan is as far north as you can go and still be in all of Israel. That's before the divided kingdom, all of Israel. And then Beersheba is as far south as you can go and still be in Israel. And so, as that time of peace had been there in the days of Solomon, so there's a promise of a return to that time in the future. So, Israel, now we see now that Israel is going to be like a woman in childbirth. She is carried to Babylon in captivity. Now, at that point, when we're talking about Babylon, we're talking about the southern kingdom of Judah. But then Israel is going to be redeemed, and the nations that carried Israel into captivity, and remember, Israel was carried into captivity not once but twice. You had the northern kingdom taken by Assyria, the southern kingdom taken by Babylon, and so it's the nations, plural, They carried Israel into captivity, will themselves be plundered. Now, chapter 5, verse 2. But as for you, Bethlehem Ephrathah. And Bethlehem, of course, is familiar to we Christians. Jesus was born there. But it was an ancient city going all the way back to David and earlier. Beth is the word for house. And lechem is just the Hebrew word for bread. And it's actually two words sort of stuck together. That's how you spell it in Hebrew. House of bread. My senior pastor likes to call it the bakery, and that works. It's I think it's significant that the bread of life would come from the house of bread. But notice it had a second name too, Ephrathah. And Ephrathah comes from farah, which is or para. The P can morph into an F if that dagish is not in the middle of it. It just means fruitful. So fruitful bakery. Just think about that. But as for you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, too little to be among the clans of Judah, because it was a tiny little town. From you will go forth for me to be ruler. One will go forth for me to be ruler in Israel. His going forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. And so now David had already come forth, so it's not a prophecy of David. It's another one who's going to be like David, who's going to be ruler, and whose goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. That's a striking prophecy. Verse 3, therefore he will give them up. Notice this is after the pains of childbirth. He will give them up until the time when she who is in labor has borne a child. Then the remainder of his brethren will return to the sons of Israel. So after the pains of childbirth comes the son who will rule. The pains of childbirth, that's the plundering, that's the captivity, that's the bad thing. And then comes the son who is going to rule. We get to chapter 6, verse 6, and it asks the question, with what shall I come to the Lord and bow myself before the God on high? Shall I come to him with burnt offerings, with yearling calves? Does the Lord take delight in thousands of rams, in 10,000 rivers of oil? What does God want? Does he want like super sacrifices? Shall I present my firstborn, like Abraham was instructed to do, for my rebellious acts, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? And now he answers in verse 8, he has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? Here it is, but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. That's striking. That's a striking call to a life of, notice, justice, kindness, and your attitude toward God, to walk humbly with your God. That's what is meant by walking in faith. Now we get to chapter 7, beginning in verse 8. There is a prayer here where Micah himself, now he's praying on behalf of the nation. He says, I have sinned against God. I don't think it was Micah himself that had done this, but that he's praying on behalf of the nation, representing the nation. He says, my enemies will see, and shame will cover them. Verse 11 is a promise of restoration. They will come out of Assyria and Egypt. And here's the prayer, Lord, shepherd your people. And then there's a restoration again. Now I want you to catch the parallel here, as in the days when you came. You see, when they come out of Egypt, or out of Assyria and Egypt, as in the days when you came out from Egypt. That's the promise, or the prayer. Nations will see and be ashamed. Notice back in verse 10, my enemies will see and shame will cover them. I want you to catch the parallel here. And then finally, there's a promise that God will forgive our sins. And notice how it had started. I've sinned against God. But I want to look at the closing verses. Look at verse 18. Who is a God like you? And I think this actually might be a play on Micah's name, which Micah, the me, or they would say Micah. I say Micah, but Micah. The me part actually is the word who. And Micah, who is like who is like Yahweh, that's what it stands for. Well, here it's who is an Elohim like you. It's. I think it might be a play on his name. Who is a God like you, who pardons iniquity and passes over the rebellious acts of the remnant of his possession? That's what he's promising here. That's what he's asking. He does not retain his anger forever, because he delights in unchanging love. And this is really our story because we have a God who pardons iniquity and passes over the rebellious act of the remnant of his possession, who delights in unchanging love, and that unchanging love was manifested on the cross when he purchased us and he paid the price for our rebellious act. And so we culminate in verses 19 and 20. He will again have compassion on us. He will tread our iniquities underfoot. Yes, you will cast all their sins into the depths of the sea. Did you catch that? He goes from talking about God to talking to God. You will cast all their sins into the depths of the sea. You will give truth to Jacob and unchanging love to Abraham, which you swore to our forefathers from the days of old. So we end on this note of prayer and of hope and of promise.